But we'd also do a thing called bust the anthill. So this is the anthill. When I bust it, all the red ants run out. Right, this is how it is taught. So here I would come in and I straight into break the nose. Right, immediately, yeah. Yeah, this is Bob.
Bob?
Yeah, everyone knows Bob. Bob gets smacked around every day, don't you, Bob? This is a fighting shillelagh. Now the difference between a fighting shillelagh and a normal shillelagh. Now getting hit with a normal shillelagh is going to hurt you anyway, but this is a fighting shillelagh because it has the thorns still on it. And if you notice on the stick now, you'll see the thorns on the stick are kept. They're clear. Then the thorns are here again, and then they're clear at the end, and some are clear at the back. And these would be used in the fights. So we would use these. The thorns are used to rip the flesh. So you would tear the face, tear the hands, tear the chest, or rip the throat. Yeah. So again, this is a part of it that's not often seen. Faction fighting in Ireland was a very different thing than we think of faction fighting now. Faction fighting was about protecting your family, your community. It was also that under British law, a lot of Irish people didn't get access to law. So if somebody does something to you, firstly you couldn't afford to take them to court, but second of all, you would have to, you wouldn't get a fair trial under English law because you were Irish. So a lot of people used to take it into their own hands, and this is where it got recorded, where the fights would happen and gangs would fight gangs over all sorts of stuff. But historically, the furthest back I can trace anything related to stick fighting was a tribe called the Harry, who were involved in the Battle of Teutoburg Forest in Germany. These defeated the Roman legions. Not the Harry on their own, but they were part of the Germanic tribes that did. One of the things that sticks out about the Harry is that they're a small tribe, but they used to blacken themselves up and attack at night. And one of the weapons they used was a long walking stick type weapon, which we can assume is a shillelagh. Obviously in the forest there's going to be lots of shillelaghs there to make, and we have history of shillelaghs being used as the first hurls. And the training of young warriors would have been on the shillelagh because it was a basic Celtic sword work. And you're not going to give your spotty 12-year-old your family sword that cost you a lot of money. You're going to give them a stick that can go out and batter and practice and train and train and train. And so this is kind of where it started off, is the kind of Celtic form sword work. It goes right through the Middle Ages. There are stories of when the Normans took parts of Ireland, they seen like the Irish people all stood with swords and stuff, armed, and they've gone, we've got a standing army here, we need to disarm these guys. So when they did, the first thing they reached for was the shillelagh, because that's what they originally trained on. Always this image of a Norman knight looking out the window at all these people with walking sticks going, Jesus, these poor Irish people, they have some terrible walking difficulties in this country. They're all carrying around with walking sticks. When it got up to kind of the sort of 19th century, the 18th, 19th century, you start having a lot of the faction fights, and we know them because they're being recorded. I mean, the famous ones in Ballybunion, which is a massive faction fight, and I think there was over 6,000 people involved in that one. I think there was something like 300 people killed in it. This is off the top of my head, I'm not 100% sure. There was a lot of people killed at the fight, for sure. And it still continued in Ireland up until the famine. It was really after the famine that things started to disappear and the fighting started to disappear. And obviously, reason being, if you can't eat, you can't fight, you've got no energy. And little misdemeanors would be forgotten, Faction fighting had its own rules, it had its own regulations, it's stuff that you did and you didn't do. And there was the author John W. Hurley states that he calls it shillelagh law. There's two parts to the faction fighting, and one was for fun, and the other was for honour, for family, for revenge, whatever you need the fights for. The fun part of it was when you would hear it at fairs and markets and church services, and so a lot of the church was very anti-stick fighting. It didn't like the idea that people couldn't be controlled, and because they were always fighting on holidays or religious holidays, because that's the only time people got together. You live wide distances, no cars, no one had a horse, so you had to walk there. So if you walked there, you'd arrange to meet and fight afterwards. And some of these would be for revenge, a lot of these would be just for fun. With the fairs and stuff, the fights and fairs, you had a thing called the 12 o'clock bell, where people would meet in the market square, and this is how I know it was fun, because if they turned up with an odd number, so if you turned up with sort of 12 people on your team and the other guy had only 11 on his or 10 on his, one would go across to fight with them, because it was just for fun. And then it would be the 12 o'clock bell would strike and the fight would begin. And this is because a lot of people will walk into these fairs, they were going there to trade, they were going to sell stuff or buy stuff, so they want to get all that sorted out of the way before they get into the pub, have a few pints, and then go meet each other outside and have a fight. These fights were raucous, there were lots of fun. They would often sit there, people had stories of them sat in the bar having a pint, talking to the guy who injured him, showing him the bruises on his legs or his head, him holding the side of his head on, and it was all a good crack. Everyone having a pint, good crack. It was just how it should be. So the fights continued up until, like I said, the famine. Before the famine, the British authorities were trying to cull the fighting anyway. They'd noticed that, and like I said, it was brought up in the House of Parliament. The faction fights were brought up in the House of Parliament primarily because it was seen that the Irish were out of control, that the British forces, the magistrates, weren't controlling the people in the area. Not like the Irish to be rebellious, but they started sending in troops. They changed the Lord Lieutenant, and they sent in another Lord Lieutenant, I can't remember his name at the moment. He came into power and told the magistrates that this would stop, and they would be enforcing stopping the fights. They would then turn up to the fights, or a suspected fight, with armed police officers. And they would shoot people. We don't want you to fight, so we're going to shoot you if you fight, which doesn't really make sense. A lot of times the fights would be moved to fields outside of the villages or outside of the markets where people can meet and still continue to fight. But again, they were very, very hot on shutting it down. The famine came along, that kind of killed a lot of the fighting up. You had then the Republican forces after the famine about United Ireland, and that stick fighting was seen as very old-fashioned, and we should now be fighting with more modern weapons. And this continued, and virtually that kind of ended the system in Ireland. There was still fighting going on. My grandfather in the 1920s, had seen a fight when he was a very young boy, and two men were fighting in Cavan, and one caught the other one in the side of the head and killed him. It's kind of the first death he'd ever seen. I have since living here, and I talk to people. People have pointed out, like in the Famine area, there was a couple of stick fighters that were there until the 1970s. People who were known as stick fighters, traditional stick fighters.
Recently enough, then.
Yeah. So it still remained in Ireland. It's just it wasn't as popular, and the shame of it is now that people don't remember that part of our history. They forget that part, and I'll get messages on the social media networks where people will say to me, I don't know what you're talking about. This never happened, and my own mum, God rest her, we were talking about it. I never heard of that. And then I kind of found fights in her area and showed her where this has happened, and she was like blown away. So it is an integral part of our history. Irish stick fighters were prized around the world. I missed this a little bit out about the history. And one of the things that they were most prized for is when England was fighting Germany or France, a lot of the Irish would go as mercenaries to fight those countries, and I suppose in a way to make money, but also the vain hope, the vain hope that England would lose and Ireland would get its independence. But when they arrived, when the Germans and the French started to notice that these people could handle a stick, the first thing they would say is, are you a stick fighter? And they go, yes. And they would move them off and teach them the sword. And because it was economical, because they picked the sword up really quickly, because there's not much difference between the sword and the stick. And because initially this all came from sort of the Celtic sword work. So that kind of history, that's part of our history again, where these guys would go off, they would learn different sword work and techniques, and then they'd fight in battles and stuff, and they'd come back, and then they'd come back to Ireland, and some of these techniques we put into the stick fighting. So we were kind of sending them off and coming back with new techniques that worked and ideas that worked, you know. So yeah, it's kind of linked into European history, not just Irish history.
Yeah, and then we were talking earlier about American history, so when they went to New York, like in gangs in New York, they brought that culture and the sticks over there.
Well, yeah, when they went to America, a lot of the Irish went over to America, and of course they were hitting New York. Sorry about that.
Right.
They were hitting New York and stuff, where obviously the Americans, well, who were only a couple of 100 years old themselves, were angry at these immigrants coming in, and so the Irish would band together. So we had the Irish who were here in Ireland would be kicking the crap out of each other or fighting each other a couple of weeks beforehand. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
They then go to America, and then they stood shoulder to shoulder fighting against the Americans, you know. And this wasn't like a rebellious thing. This was just like protecting their own community within that environment. The gangs out there, as you mentioned, the film The Gangs in New York. The Gangs in New York is based on the Dead Rabbits, was a gang based in 5 Points in New York. And they were well known to Tamati Hall. They were all known about the Dead Rabbits, and they were under Tamati and looked after Tamati. And of course a lot of the coppers over there were Irish as well, you know. So blind eyes would be, you know, put into place when a faction fight went on. It also happened in London. You had a section of London just off Tottenham Court Road, which was a major Irish slum a couple of 100 years ago, and people would go down there to see the fights. So you'd have bare knuckle boxing, you'd have stick fighting going on, and of course it would be entertainment, so people would go down and they would see men and women fighting both hand to hand and with sticks and whatever else they fancied fighting with that day, you know. So I suppose that's probably where the nickname the Fighting Irish came from, you know, that we've always been fighting wherever we go, you know. So now in America, Irish stick has taken off massively. It's really come to, it's really gone great over there. And we have some really good people behind us and helping us, you know.
How did you first get involved in stick fighting? So when did you first come across it?
Well, my story is a bit unusual. I used to work in prisons in the UK. So I was a prison officer for years, and used to deal with some very violent people. And not all of them violent, some good people too, who just made wrong decisions. But I've always been to the martial arts. So I had an injury. I damaged my knee running to an alarm bell. I fell down a stairwell and damaged my knee. So I had a couple of operations on it, and I put a lot of weight on. And the doctor said to me, you know, you need to lose the weight, fatty, you know. You need to get off it, fatty. And I said, well, you mean fatty food? No, fatty, just stop eating. And so I started looking at the gym and stuff, and I've always found the gym all right, but it's quite boring. Whereas martial arts, you would meet people, you would train with them, and then you go for a beer afterwards, and you'd have friends for life. So I started looking to different martial arts, but my previous martial arts experience had just linked into everything that was in the area. Everything I'd done was very similar to what I'd done before. So it was kind of depressing, really, looking around to find something new. So I found one night that I'm a bit of a martial arts nerd. So I had a few beers in me one night, and I was sat. It was actually wine, red wine. I was sat on the computer looking through, and I looked at Filipino martial arts and Japanese martial arts and Chinese martial arts, stuff that I'd done in the past, and I thought, what about Irish? What about my own culture? You know. And I laughed and I put it in, and the first that came up was Bat-Er, you know, and Glen Doyle. So when I got the next morning, I researched it, and it all came out. You know, there were sites on there that will tell you if someone's like full of it, or tell you if someone's genuine, and everyone was saying that this man is genuine. He's the real deal.
This is Glen Doyle.
Yeah, Glen Doyle. So I wrote to Mr. Doyle, and I said, right, you know, let's just see if I can come over and train with him in Canada. And he said, yeah, please come. So I maxed up my credit cards and off I went to Canada, and I trained in it. And it's, you know, that was nearly 15 years ago. Yeah, it's an amazing system. It kind of taught me that in a lot of martial arts you're taught how basic punching and kicking. One of the first things I was taught is called the murder hole block, which is a block that comes down. It's a head strike coming in to hit you in the head, and she taught me how to block it, but in a way that I'm hitting the other guy with his own weapon, which I thought, this is fantastic. It's very ergonomic. It's very direct. It's no messing around. I'm just going to hurt you and I'm going to move on. And so that's really attracted to me, and especially now as I'm getting older, it's harder nowadays to kind of spend 3 hours jumping in the air and throwing kicks. I might do 2 or 3, but then I'll spend the rest of the night on ice, in a cold shower praying for death. So nowadays when I train, it makes a lot more sense to use the shillelagh, and the shillelagh is a very clever weapon. The system is very intelligent. It's very direct, and it's very sometimes simplistic in its intent. The intent is to go in and finish the fight, and that all deals in with faction fights, which would be multiple opponents. So with the shillelagh, you're dealing not just with one person, you're thinking of the other people there who might get involved with the fight as well. Yeah. So it's even training you how to step and move.
And is the Doyle Irish stick fighting then one style of stick fighting, or is there only one style?
No, the style of stick fighting, the Doyle is the main one in the world at the moment, and it's probably the biggest. There are other styles of stick fighting, and again, these are all dependent on different ideas and areas. I mean, if you look at the Irish language, the prime example, how words and phrases change from different areas. Not so much nowadays, because we can travel. In 2 hours we're in Dublin. Whereas years ago that would have been a day and a half ride. So things change. So you would find different styles of fighting throughout the country. And I spoke to a Shanachie in Sligo, and we were talking about stick fighting, and he was telling me about how that there was a guy. I think it's Ballymote or the other side of Sligo, and he fought with 2 sticks, and I've heard people fight with a small cudgel and a knife. A small cudgel, this is a shillelagh. A cudgel is a smaller stick, like so. Now this isn't a small stick, but this is actually a 18th 19th century cudgel. As you can tell by the patina on it, and it's a fair old weight. But some people, there would be styles where they would fight with the small cudgel and a knife. There would be the women would fight. There would be some women stick fighters too. It was an equal opportunities destruction system, but they would often use stones in socks, which is their weapon. They were easy to attain. Just take your sock off, put a stone in it, and hit somebody in the head. So there were different styles of fighting. Unfortunately, a lot of them are gone. A lot of those systems have died out. We were only saved because the Doyle ancestry went to Newfoundland. We can trace it back to Ireland, and they left Ireland. The words were, he left Ireland in a hurry. He went down to Wexford, and there was 2 ships. One was going to Tasmania and one was going to Newfoundland. And he took the one to Newfoundland, and Newfoundland has a very big Irish heritage. There's a lot of Irish people live there. If you listen to the accent, they sound like they're from Cork or Kerry, that kind of twang in their accent. And it was also a lot of stuff survived. Like, it's the only place that's around that has a Gaeltacht, where they speak Irish, which has always been the way. And of course, stick fighting, the tradition survived, and this stayed within the Doyle family. It was up until about the 1990s. I think it was 98 when Glen's dad died. So it was then. When his dad was terminally ill, he approached him and just said, look, I have no children. When I die, this system dies with me. I want permission to teach it, because he wouldn't teach it to people outside of the family. You could be a cousin, you could learn it, but if it was only outside, and maybe if your surname was Doyle, you might have been a chance to teach it or learn it. But his dad said yes, and that's then started teaching him. Glen has a long history in Kung Fu, was renowned in Canada, All-American champion, and North American champion, and all that sort of stuff. But the first martial art he learned was Bat-Er, boxing and Bat-Er, and so that's what kind of saved it, and this is how we have it today.
Oh, fair. So was his dad, Greg, would he teach it as well, or he just had to pass down?
He taught his son. So Glen would often say, you know, he'd be sat on a Saturday morning watching the cartoons with a bowl of cereal, and he'd hear the dad getting up. He'd be like, oh no, and they'd try, come on, out, TV off, up goes the stick, and off we go and train. You know, and that's the way it was. He was taught, and that's the way his dad was taught, and so it was. You know, it was sort of time immemorial that carried on. You know.
Okay. Yeah, so did they make sticks at all, or were they just practitioners?
No, they just swung the sticks.
Yeah.
From what I know.
It's probably a lot to do both.
Yeah, there are people who do both.
Mm-hmm.
Very talented people, I must say. I'm fortunately not one of them. I'm only a swinger. I'm not a swing sticks, nothing else. I don't swing at anything else. But sticks, I go to. I mean, Ireland is so blessed. There's a long tradition of stick making in Ireland. We have some fantastic stick makers here. You know, some of the guys that I use, Declan Casey is obviously probably the most premier stick fighter. Again, an hereditary stick maker, not fighter, stick maker in the country.
Where's he based, sorry, again?
He's based in Ennis, County Clare. My home county of Waterford, we got PJ O'Brien down there. PJ is a great stick maker. Got some PJ sticks. Colin Cribben, who's based in Roscommon, he makes some fantastic sticks. You know, and you have like if you go online, Derry Hicks, based in Derry Hick in Mayo, fantastic stick maker again, but a really huge selection of really good sticks to get, you know, all sorts of different makes. I mean, the shillelaghs themselves, there is a belief that the shillelagh should just be of blackthorn, but years ago, even the name shillelagh is kind of funny because it comes from the village of Shillelagh. And there's shillelagh, which was another old Irish term for the stick, but there is part of it that the woods outside of Shillelagh was oak woods, oak forest, and these were used to make ships for the English. So when the English would see Irish people with shillelaghs, they would go, "Ah, right, Paddy, you got your shillelagh," like that, because it was shillelagh wood. Well, actually, that wasn't what they were called. Each area, of course, had a name for its own stick, what they call the sticks, you know, different, you know, colloquialisms for them. But eventually, like everything we do in Ireland, we take an insult and we turn it around and we make it something to be proud of. And this is what we've done with the shillelagh, you know. So yeah, it's pretty amazing history. Yeah, did that answer your question?
Yes, did, yeah, definitely did. Yeah.
Did I go off on one again?
Yeah, no, that's where we get the knowledge. You know, that's where we get the knowledge. So the sticks can be made out of oak, blackthorn, any kind of wood really, or just whatever they have to hand in the area.
Any
right?
wood
Yeah.
you can have. I mean, this is a blackthorn. I have a couple of there's ash ones there. And you have composite woods, so where people are making them out of. So this is a blackthorn. I think this is an ironwood, American ironwood. This is an American stick. Ash here, or hazel here. Sorry, hazel. Again, there's ash, and then you have the unusual ones. They're from the roots. You can see the little bits where the roots are. This are all been covered. So this is an antique stick. So people have gone through and they've cut them off. And you see where it's worn down, where people, I mean, why would you hold a stick there? They're obviously holding the stick here to fight with it. Yeah, it's a beautiful stick. But yeah, very unusual. We call that Gandalf's shillelagh.
Yeah, I was thinking that earlier when you were showing me. I just didn't want to say it.
There's in Kilkenny Cathedral. I'm not a historian. I'm just a stick swinger, so you know.
Pinch of salt.
Yeah, pinch of salt. So take it all, enjoy it, have it, research it, right? But in Kilkenny Cathedral, there's a mausoleum. There's a sarcophagus there, and there's actually a picture of a guy holding a carving of a shillelagh in his hand, right? Which we take to be a shillelagh. It's a very cool little picture, but that's dating back to about the 11th century, you know. So. It has to be older than we think. If you look at the system of fighting, the way we fight, there's a lot of techniques in there for something that's supposed to be only a couple 100 years old.
So
the basic stance is this, okay? So again, This is my sword and my shield. My shield is here protecting my body. My body's behind the weapon. Yeah, so nothing gets through the weapon. Yeah, it's to stop anybody getting through to you. The punching. So we punch. It's not strikes as such. So the punch would be here. So I'm punching out. This comes from a pugilistic style that we have. It's that punch out there, and this would hit the forearm, and the stick comes back to you, so you're reloading automatically. Again, we can do what we call the bounce or the double tap. 1, 2. So we can punch it twice, and you can see it's pretty quick. And so a lot of the fighting, because faction fights were very close contact, you would start off from a long range here, and then you would get very close in. So if I was here and I was punching, I could thrash the head, so I can go 1, 2, yeah, and then you could enter in. You're coming in through, boom, there's your kick, there's your bust, and so you're punching, breaking rib, and punching in. Okay. Then again, you're shutting down the distance. If you're blocking, so you're blocking the head strike. Again, when you block the head strike, I was saying to you earlier about what's called the murder hole. As that strike's coming down, I'm blocking here, and then I'm bringing it down into the chest. So it means that the weapon is coming down into his head and already breaking the face or damaging the face. And again, I'm taking the balance. So the disarm would be just the countermeasure, coming in here and breaking that, and then finishing them off here. Yeah, you're punching with this. You're punching with the stick, but you're punching with your hip here. So you're coming up into the rib cage, and this is called dig for your dinner. Imagine your dinner's in here, and I'm punching into the dinner. Again, if we're looking at the nose, so a lot of striking was to the nose. So the punch here would be to the nose there. But we'd also do a thing called bust the anthill. So this is the anthill. When I bust it, all the red ants run out. Right. This is how it is taught. So here I would come in and I straight in to break the nose. Right, immediately. Yeah, no messing about. And as you can see, it's very much get in and finish it, and then move on to the next fella. You know, we're very close in. We're starting off at this range. We're ending up in this range because this is where people fight. Yeah, too far away. We can still do techniques far away. We can come in, we can punch the head, we can punch, we can break the eye socket here, punch him under the chin from that long range. Yeah, but also it means that I can keep him at that range, or if he's approaching me and I want to keep him away, we do what's called thrashing. So thrashing is where I thrash across the face here or here. Yeah, or I would then, if I wanted to, I could thrash behind the head to take the back of the skull and switch him off. Yeah, switch the brain off for a while. And then kicking. So kicking would involve, so here we would come up and we would kick. And this is called a log kick. And this is the boot used in a log kick. And you've probably filmed this before, but this is called a hobnail boot. And these are all hobnails. So these would be used to utilize to rip the flesh of the shin. So as I was coming up, my foot wouldn't be a very high kick, because in Ireland you have, you might have noticed, there's quite wet ground. So the kick would be here, and I'm coming up the shin there, and so I'm dragging the nails up the foot or the shin. And then what I would do is, when I got to a certain point in the knee, you would push forward with your body weight, and this is to push the knee back and then extend through the knee to dislocate and finish the knee. So it's all very violent, very quick, very aggressive. You know, you would have eye gouging and things like that, which would be part of it. Obviously these aren't taught to beginners. None of this stuff is taught to beginners. This is just giving you an idea of what it's like. But eye gouging would be to blind them, to injure them, you know, because if you're going to kill me, I'm going to hurt him first. Yeah, and that's a lot of the system, really, in a nutshell. We have a ranking system. There's only 5 grades. Level 1, 2 and 3, they're just levels. And they are just it's not like I'm a black belt in Irish stick fighting. It would be kind of like, well, I'm a coach, so we grade 1 to 4. 1 to 3 is student, and then 4 would be coach. So coach would be someone who could teach people, you know, someone who's proven themselves to be a good teacher. And then 5 would be instructor, so someone who could teach a coach, but also teach a lot of classes. So the grading system, traditionally, it would just be taught within families, so there would be no grading. You know, it'd just be, as you got a bit better, you'd be taught something more. But obviously nowadays, you know, you want your students to know how good they are, what level they're at, how effective it can be, you know, how effective they can be. And, you know, that they're being taught by someone who's actually trained in the system. So someone's qualified as a coach and someone's qualified as an instructor. You know, because we want to spread the word, but we also want to make sure that we have good people spread the word. It's deep rooted in Irish culture. It's been a part of us for maybe millennia. You know, we'll never really know, but it's a part of who we are. It's that warrior part. This is the martial art of Brian Boru, Cuchulainn. All these people would have trained in this initially, you know, and it's the system that, you know, this martial art is linked to us. It's part of the Celtic. You know, we call ourselves Celts with pride. Well, this comes from that same bunch of people, you know.
Sure. Well, thanks very much, Bernard. Appreciate it.
Oh, absolutely, my pleasure. Absolutely.
And what was it called again?
It's a hobnail boot. It's what they used generations ago before. It was a cheaper version of boots that they would use for grip and stuff like that.
It was like another defence thing.
Oh, it was just for walking, everyday walking and stuff like that. But the hobnails would preserve the boot so it would last longer. But when they would fight with him, they would use the hobnails to rip the skin, so the kick would come upwards onto the shin, but would go through into the bone, and then they would push their weight through the knee to break the knee. So they push the knee through. Yeah, it's great.
I need to get it for.
Yeah, I don't know if you can anymore.
What time is it? Hondo! For